The origins of prosocial behavior. Are people selfish or selfless by nature? The basic issue addressed in this chapter concerns whether or not humans are genetically predisposed to be prosocial and helpful. This is a question that has been of major interest to evolutionary theorists over the years. Charles Darwin, 1859, originally argued that evolution is determined primarily by the principle of survival of the fittest. Those individuals who are best adapted to their environment will be most likely to survive and reproduce, and thus their genetic characteristics will become more prevalent in the species in succeeding generations. Darwin's theory was interpreted at the time to mean that individuals who were the most selfish would be the most likely to survive. But against this argument was the simple fact that studies of humans and other social animals produced widespread evidence of prosocial, often apparently altruistic, behavior. The evidence, helping was such a common and seemingly fundamental aspect of social life, led evolutionary theorists to challenge the principle of survival of the fittest that traditionally directed the field. Thus, both philosophers and scientists have, over the years, come to recognize the impressive depth of selfless behavior in human and animal societies, as well as the significant capacity for selfishness. This leads us to the focus of this chapter. The question. The central question of this chapter is, are people naturally inclined to be selfless and altruistic? In this chapter, we attempt to answer this question by examining the evolutionary and genetic processes that play a role in altruistic behaviors, as well as the biologically related mechanisms that appear to be involved when people act prosocially. Evolutionary-based theories provide a general framework and rationale for why people might be prosocially disposed by nature. Biological structures and processes present the mechanisms by which these genetic predispositions are manifested. They explain how and when forms of prosocial behavior will be expressed. This chapter is thus organized into 3 main sections. In the first of these, we briefly outline some of the basic issues, terminology, methods, and limits that need to be considered in evaluating the question of whether people are prosocial by nature. In the second section, we discuss traditional and contemporary evolutionary theories and supporting evidence. In the third section, we illustrate with the topic of empathy how biologically based mechanisms operate to produce prosocial behavior. Asking the right question. The question of whether there is a genetic and thus biological basis to be helpful toward others is deceptively simple. It is actually a very complex question that needs to be framed in a correct and responsible way, and even then it is a question that is difficult to answer. One of the problems involves how to integrate the different ways that people from diverse disciplines look at and talk about the issue. A second problem involves understanding how biological and environmental influences are conceptually related. A third issue focuses on the methodological challenges for disentangling biological and environmental influences on behavior. And a fourth problem relates to how to interpret the data and the societal implications of research of this type. What do we mean by altruism? As we described in Chapter 1, the significance of prosocial action in the social life of humans has attracted the interest of a wide range of scholars. These scholars bring philosophical, psychological, and biological perspectives to the topic. They also bring different terminologies. One problem, therefore, is agreeing on a definition of the term altruism. In Chapter 1, we defined altruism in terms of people's intentions and motivations when they offered help to another person. We distinguished it from helping, which is defined by its consequences rather than by its intentions. Helping is an act that benefits another person. These definitions represent a social psychological perspective. For biologists and evolutionary theorists who work with a variety of different species, such as ants, bees, mice, and monkeys, however, intentions in a human sense often do not apply or are impossible to assess. Thus, these researchers use the term altruism to refer broadly to any action that involves some costs for the helper, but increases the likelihood that other members of their species will survive, reproduce, and thus pass their genes on to successive generations. So for these scientists, the beneficiary of altruism is not a particular individual, but a particular gene pool. Because this chapter primarily examines the biological basis of prosocial actions, we adopt a biological perspective and the terminology that accompanies it, nature and/or nurture. A second difficulty with answering the question about whether people are altruistic by nature involves the dynamic and complex nature of altruistic behavior. Evolutionary theorists and geneticists have long understood how certain physical traits are genetically determined. Eye color is inherited from parents. Each of them passes on genes for eye color to a child, and the combination of their dominant and recessive genes determines what the child's eye color will be. In addition, there have been some remarkable recent advances in our knowledge of genes and how they affect people throughout their lifetimes. For example, medical researchers have identified specific genes associated with several diseases, such as Parkinson's disease and breast cancer. In addition, the ambitious Human Genome Project, a project jointly sponsored by the National Human Genome Research Institute and the U.S. Department of Energy, has now mapped the entire human genetic structure, creating the possibility of understanding a wide range of human orientations, talents, and susceptibilities. These advances in the study of genetics also hold great promise for understanding prosocial and altruistic behavior. In addition, psychologists studying how people develop different kinds of personalities have converged on appreciating the potentially significant contribution of genetic factors to things such as temperament. The term temperament refers to general behavioral tendencies, such as how active a person is, or how responsive the person is to the people and things around him or her. Clark and Watson, 1999. Developmental psychologists who study the behaviors of newborns report individual differences in their temperaments from almost the moment of birth. For example, some babies are hard, i.e. fussy, cranky, prone to cry, and others are easy, i.e. calm, quiet. DeHart, Strouf, and Cooper, 2003. Many researchers now believe that these kinds of differences in newborns' temperaments are due to genetic or biological factors. Nevertheless, because human behavior, including prosocial, helping, and altruistic behavior, involves complex motivations, decisions, and actions, it is unlikely that it can be traced directly to certain strands of DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. Rather, these behaviors are likely to be the indirect product of the actions of a substantial number of genes interacting in a complex manner. Moreover, these genetic processes are not immune to environmental, social, and cultural influences. Instead, one of the major discoveries in contemporary behavioral genetics is that there is a constant interplay between our genes and the environment. That is, genes influence how people react to and act on the world around them. Their environment, in turn, affects which genes will be expressed. That is, genes that actually affect a person's physical appearance, physiology, and/or behavior, and when this expression will occur. Thus, even asking the question of whether some human behavior or characteristic is solely due to nature or to nurture is now considered to be inappropriate and passé by those who study prosocial actions and other complex social behaviors. A complex interaction between genes and the environment is responsible for most behaviors, including prosocial ones. That's epigenetics. When a gene is expressed, the observable effects are called the phenotype. However, not all observable characteristics are produced by genes. Some could be due to environment. Hair color, for example, could be due to a person's genes or to a bottle of hair coloring. If it is the former, then the phenotype matches the genotype. Disentangling nature and nurture. Recognizing this complexity, it is still valuable to understand how genetic and biological factors contribute to the development of prosocial dispositions and actions. How can psychologists disentangle environmental forces, which operate even from before birth, from genetic and biological influences? A general strategy for determining whether a type of response has primarily a genetic basis involves looking for similarities in these behaviors across organisms, cultures, and individuals who are genetically similar, but who have had very different learning experiences. If common outcomes and processes can be identified despite vast differences in socialization, then an inherited biological capacity is likely to be a factor. Techniques that represent this approach include cross-species, cross-cultural, and behavioral genetics studies. An alternative approach to determine the contribution of genetics is to study neonates, newborns, whose behavior has yet to be influenced by socialization. Another way of studying the link between genetics and behavior is by examining the relationship between certain types of genetic defects or hormonal deficiencies and patterns of social behavior. In cross-cultural studies, researchers investigate whether certain social behaviors or personal characteristics are found in a large number of different and apparently unrelated societies. If they are, this would suggest that the common behaviors or characteristics are critical to human survival and thus have some genetic basis. In cross-species comparative research, demonstrating that the same pattern of behavior found in humans is also consistently present in other animals, particularly in gorillas and chimpanzees, with whom people share 98% of their DNA sequences, would provide a clue that it may be a part of human nature. Behavioral genetics techniques consider genetic relationships between individuals, such as family members or twins, that might produce similar talents or predispositions. Pollum and Caspi, 1999. Have you ever noticed behaviors that seem to run in families? For example, a large percentage of outstanding athletes have relatives who are also quite good at sports. Michael Vick, the current quarterback for professional football's Atlanta Falcons, has a brother and a first cousin who are also outstanding football players. Musical talent also runs in families. Johann Sebastian Bach had several sons who were also excellent composers. One technique that is commonly used in this type of work is quantifying the heritability of a characteristic. Heritability concerns the percentage of the differences that exist among people that is inherited or may be due to heredity. If a characteristic has 50% heritability, this means that half of the variation or differences between people on that trait can be attributed to inherited genetic factors. Other researchers carry out neonate, newborn baby studies. Infants' behavior is examined very early in life, when the influences of socialization and learning experiences are minimized. As was suggested earlier, these studies do find evidence of some innate social behaviors in humans. For example, babies less than a day old are able to imitate the facial expressions of adults. Metsov, 2002. This finding, along with evidence that other primates also imitate adults at an early age, strongly suggests that the tendency to imitate is innate. Finally, there are other techniques that directly investigate the impact of genetic processes on behavior. For instance, hormones influence several forms of behavior, e.g., aggression, sexual behavior, maternal behavior. Experiments conducted with animals, e.g., by varying levels of testosterone, and studies of hormonal or genetic abnormalities in humans, e.g., a male who carries 2 Y chromosomes instead of the normal one, can provide evidence of genetic causes of social behaviors. Thus, there are several methods that enable us to ask whether some human behaviors are innate. See Delilah and Gottsman, 2004. Interpreting and applying biological theories. Of course, there are also significant limitations to these approaches. Each approach is fallible in its own way. For example, Cross-cultural similarities could be the result of similar necessities of life that produce the development of similar cultural solutions all around the world. Modern communication and transportation advances of the past 100 years, have also tended to homogenize the experiences of people of the world, and these shared experiences provide yet another reason why similarities might be observed. Cross-species generalizations should also be made cautiously because humans clearly are unique animals, relying more heavily on higher-order cognitive processes than other animals. Thus, methodologically, only a convergence of conclusions across these different techniques should be taken as strong evidence of a genetic basis of altruism or any other complex human behavior. We can provide evidence from each of these approaches, pointing to the systematic influence of genetics and biology in prosocial behavior. However, even as we make the case for genetic and biological influences on prosocial and altruistic behavior, it is important to understand what this means and what it does not. These findings need to be interpreted cautiously for several reasons. First, the impact of inherited characteristics to explain a person's or group of people's behavior is typically dependent on environmental influences. Environmental forces can increase or decrease the impact of genetic predispositions. No legitimate biologist would propose that a single gene, operating independently of other genes and environmental factors, irrevocably and irreversibly could determine whether a person will or will not engage in a complex behavior such as altruism. Ridley and Dawkins, 1984. Genes that directly affect brain activities and other physiological processes are turned on and turned off by events that happen in the environment. Ridley, 2003. Second, environmental influences often modify genetic factors. For example, height is clearly an inherited characteristic, greatly influenced by genes, but in the United States and Canada, people born in the 20th century, the 1900s, were, on average, substantially taller than those born in the 18th or 19th century, 1700s or 1800s. This was not because of differences in genes, but because people's diets became more nutritious, and this environmental factor substantially influenced average height. Third, even when a substantial genetic influence is implicated by a large heritability component, heritability only enables researchers to make predictions at an aggregate or population level, not at an individual level. For example, individuals with 2 alcoholic parents have a greater chance of becoming alcoholic adults than individuals with no alcoholic parents, but this does not mean that any individual person with this heredity must become alcoholic. There is currently no way to identify specifically which children of alcoholic parents will indeed develop alcoholism. Fourth, in interpreting these studies and results, it is important to be aware of some of the political implications and social controversies that have accompanied the raising of this question historically. For instance, social Darwinism, the application of the principle of survival of the fittest to social systems, was used in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, to justify colonialism and the exploitation of people of color in Africa. Racist ideologies, based on claims of genetic superiority, provided the basis for the Nazi Holocaust and for apartheid in South Africa and, more recently, played a role in brutal civil wars in places such as Kosovo, Rwanda, and Sudan. Because of the misapplication and abuse of biological views of human behavior, social scientists have shied away from this perspective. Nevertheless, we believe that it is appropriate for social scientists to study the genetic basis of behavior while being careful to interpret and apply these theories responsibly. Biology does not determine any individual's or any group's destiny. The question still remains, however, of whether this approach will actually provide evidence of a genetic basis for altruism in humans. We now turn our attention to evolutionary theories that can suggest why people could be selfish or selfless by nature.